The flight was about to depart from New York to London, and the passengers were beginning to settle into their seats in anticipation of the long journey ahead. The air was filled with a sense of excitement as the plane filled up with travelers, some embarking on a much-needed vacation, while others were preparing for important meetings or family reunions in distant lands. But amidst the buzz of anticipation, something unusual began to unfold in business class. Claire Simmons sat in her assigned seat, a window spot near the front of the cabin. She had been looking forward to this flight for weeks. She had a major legal case awaiting her in London, and this was the perfect opportunity to both work on her case notes and have some time to herself away from the constant demands of her busy career. Her laptop was out and ready, but there was one thing she noticed almost immediately: her seat wasn't what she had reserved. At first, she thought it was just a minor mix-up, a mistake that could easily be fixed. She was quick to flag down a flight attendant and explain the issue, pointing out that her reservation was clear and her seat was supposed to be 2B, not 3A. But the flight attendant seemed distracted and unsure of how to handle the situation. The attendant apologized, but explained that there had been some last-minute changes to the seating arrangements and that Claire's seat was now occupied by someone else. This was something Claire wasn't willing to accept. It wasn't the first time she had flown on this airline, and she knew that paying customers like her were entitled to the seat they had booked. She had made a plan for the flight, and she intended to stick to it. The situation escalated when the flight attendants were unable to offer a satisfactory solution. They suggested moving her to a different seat further back in the cabin, but Claire refused. She was firm in her belief that the error was not hers and that the airline needed to fix it. She didn't want to be inconvenienced, especially with the critical work she had to do. She knew her rights as a passenger and felt this was an issue that needed immediate resolution. The disagreement caught the attention of other passengers who began to murmur among themselves. They glanced over at Claire, who was now visibly upset and frustrated as she raised her voice and demanded to speak with someone in charge. The crew was starting to feel the pressure from the growing tension in the cabin. Some passengers were uneasy, but no one had yet spoken up to support Claire's side of the argument. It wasn't long before the flight attendants decided to involve the captain. They knew that things were beginning to get out of hand and that the situation could quickly spiral into something more disruptive. They paged Captain Mark Thompson, who was in the cockpit preparing for takeoff. He had been flying for over 2 decades and had seen his fair share of difficult situations, but this one felt different. The moment he stepped into the cabin, he could sense the tension in the air. Claire stood in front of her seat, arms crossed, her face flushed with anger as she argued her case. The captain's first instinct was to remain calm, to assess the situation with logic and reason. But as Claire's voice grew louder and more insistent, he could feel the pressure mounting. He knew that a delay in departure could be costly and disrupt the entire flight schedule. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, but he also knew that he had to make a decision quickly. It was clear to him that Claire wasn't backing down, and he made a call that would change the course of the flight. Captain Thompson made the difficult decision to remove Claire from the plane before they could even taxi to the runway. His calm but firm voice echoed through the cabin as he instructed security to escort her off the aircraft. The door was closed behind her, and as Claire stepped out into the terminal, she looked back at the plane one last time, her face a mixture of disbelief and anger as the wheels of the plane began to roll forward toward the runway. As Claire Simmons was escorted off the plane by security, her mind raced with a mix of anger and disbelief. She had always prided herself on her calm demeanor, especially in high-pressure situations, but this was something else entirely. Her mind buzzed with thoughts of her upcoming case, the work she had planned for the flight, and now this humiliation. How could this happen? How could an airline, of all places, mishandle something as simple as seating? She had been polite at first, but when the attendants failed to fix the issue, her patience wore thin. She had every right to be upset, every right to demand a solution. As the doors of the plane closed behind her, Claire's world felt like it had shifted on its axis. The rush of frustration grew in her chest, the feeling of being wronged, the anger that her carefully organized travel plans had been torn apart in an instant. She had flown this airline countless times, and her impeccable track record as a customer seemed to mean nothing now. The more she thought about it, the more her emotions swelled. This wasn't just about a seating error. This was about respect, and she wasn't going to let it slide. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she walked away from the aircraft. With every step, her resolve grew stronger. This wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. She would make sure the airline knew just how wrong they had been, how they had treated her, a paying customer, like she was nothing. She would make them pay for this mistake. Claire was a lawyer, and she knew exactly what she had to do. Already her mind was working through the possibilities. She could file a lawsuit for wrongful removal for the inconvenience caused. She could make it a public spectacle, get the media involved, and make sure this issue was known across the country. After all, what was the point of being a prominent lawyer if she couldn't stand up for herself when it mattered? She would make her voice heard. Her phone buzzed in her hand as she dialed her office number, her voice clipped and sharp as she explained the situation to her assistant. Claire could feel the rage building again, but this time she focused it. She wasn't going to let this pass quietly. The assistant on the other end was sympathetic, but Claire cut her off. She didn't need sympathy. She needed action. By the time Claire reached the terminal, she was already thinking of her next move. She knew that the airline would likely try to brush this under the rug, but she wasn't going to let them. She would write a letter to the CEO, demanding an explanation, an apology. And if they didn't comply, she would make sure the world knew about their appalling behavior. Her reputation as a fierce advocate for justice wasn't just a career, it was her identity. She had built it carefully over the years, fighting for clients and causes, earning respect in the legal community. But now she would have to fight for herself. As Claire stood in the terminal, still fuming from the experience, she realized just how deeply this situation had shaken her. It wasn't just about the flight, it was about the principle. She had been wronged, and she would make sure everyone knew it. This wasn't just a battle over a seat on a plane. This was a battle for her dignity, her reputation, and her right to be treated fairly. And she would not back down. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a message from a fellow lawyer in her circle, a friend who had heard about the incident and was offering support. She smirked at the message, knowing that the support she truly needed now would come from herself. This was only the beginning. Claire Simmons was just getting started. The incident between Claire Simmons and the airline captain didn't take long to gain momentum. Within hours, photos and videos from the flight began circulating across social media, with passengers offering varying accounts of what had happened. Some passengers expressed support for Claire, outraged that an error over a seat had escalated into her being removed from the plane. Others sided with Captain Mark Thompson, commending him for maintaining order and not letting one unruly passenger disrupt the entire flight. The debate quickly became a trending topic, attracting widespread attention. On Twitter, the hashtag #Seatgate was born as users shared their opinions, some joking about the situation while others shared angry posts condemning the airline's handling of the affair. News outlets picked up the story, and it soon became a subject of debate on television talk shows, online forums, and radio programs. For Claire, it was both validating and overwhelming. The attention was fast and furious, but it wasn't just the media storm she had to navigate. It was the fact that her name was now associated with a controversy that would follow her for some time. She was flooded with messages from people offering support, others condemning her for her actions. One person on social media wrote, "Why didn't she just take the other seat? People are too entitled these days." Another person, however, shared, "As a frequent traveler, I can't believe an airline would treat a paying customer like that. Go Claire!" But beyond the internet buzz, Claire had more pressing matters at hand. She was preparing for a major case in London, and now, instead of focusing on her work, she found herself dealing with a public relations disaster. In her office, her assistant updated her on the media coverage. Claire's legal team quickly realized that the story was gaining traction faster than they had anticipated. In the next few hours, reporters began to call, eager for an exclusive interview or a statement from Claire. But Claire wasn't ready to speak to anyone yet. She wasn't interested in explaining her actions to the press. She was focused on making the airline pay for their mistake. Meanwhile, the airline's PR team scrambled to craft a statement that would address the growing backlash. They released a generic message praising Captain Thompson's decision to uphold safety and the importance of managing disruptions on flights. But it felt insufficient to the public, who were demanding more than just the standard corporate response. People were angry that a simple customer service issue had spiraled into such a spectacle. Many passengers questioned why the airline hadn't made more of an effort to accommodate Claire when she first raised the issue. Had they tried hard enough to resolve the seating issue? Was the situation handled with enough care? The airline's failure to publicly acknowledge the full extent of their mistake left a gap for critics to fill. On online forums, former flight attendants and aviation professionals began sharing their own insights about how airlines typically handle seating conflicts, revealing that the airline's approach might have been too rigid and lacking empathy. The public began to question not just the specific circumstances of the incident, but the airline's general approach to customer service. On the flip side, Claire's reputation as a lawyer, known for her fierce stance on justice, only added fuel to the fire. People viewed her as a woman who would never let a wrongdoing go unnoticed. This didn't help the airline's case either, as they quickly realized they had underestimated the power of someone like Claire. Despite the growing wave of support, Claire wasn't about to let the situation fester in the court of public opinion. She understood the weight of the legal battle ahead. What had started as a routine flight had now morphed into something far more significant, and Claire was determined to make sure her side of the story wasn't just a footnote in a media frenzy. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane anymore, it was about accountability, and Claire was prepared to take her fight to the next level. In the midst of the chaos, Claire's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her colleague. "You're trending everywhere. This could get messy. What's your next move?" Claire paused, took a deep breath, and typed her response. This isn't over yet. The storm had only just begun. As the media frenzy surrounding Claire Simmons and the airline continued to grow, the airline's internal investigation began in earnest. Behind closed doors, executives and employees scrambled to piece together what had happened and how to handle the escalating situation. The airline had initially issued a general statement defending Captain Mark Thompson's decision, emphasizing that he had acted in the best interest of maintaining order and safety on the flight. But as public scrutiny intensified, it became clear that they needed to dig deeper to fully understand the series of events that had led to Claire's removal. The airline's legal team worked overtime to gather information from flight attendants, ground staff, and even passengers who had been present when the incident occurred. They also reviewed footage from security cameras to piece together a timeline of what had happened. What they discovered was far more complicated than the initial accounts had suggested. It turned out that the mistake had not been Claire's, but rather the result of a clerical error within the airline's reservation system. A miscommunication had caused her to be assigned to a seat that was already occupied. The problem had been identified too late for a quick fix, and by the time Claire noticed, there was no time to resolve it before the flight was set to depart. However, the airline had failed to inform her in a timely and transparent manner. Instead of offering her a reasonable alternative or apologizing for the oversight, the staff had handled the situation poorly. The flight attendants, feeling the pressure of an increasingly tense situation, had only exacerbated the conflict by not taking Claire's concerns seriously. To make matters worse, the airline's records showed that the initial offer of an alternative seat had been dismissed without proper explanation. A more reasonable offer, one that could have resolved the situation amicably, had never been presented. Claire, frustrated by the lack of communication and the apparent disregard for her concerns, had become more upset, and the confrontation had escalated quickly. The airline's investigation revealed that the issue could have been resolved far more calmly if a flight attendant or a senior staff member had taken a few minutes to properly de-escalate the situation. Instead, the situation spiraled, and Captain Thompson, perhaps prematurely, made the decision to remove Claire from the plane. The airline's investigation not only confirmed that the error had been on their part, but also highlighted a systemic failure in how they dealt with customer complaints. It became evident that the company's approach to handling customer disputes was outdated, relying too heavily on enforcing policies without considering the emotional dynamics at play. The investigation pointed to a lack of training in conflict resolution and suggested that the airline needed to rethink its customer service protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. For Claire, this revelation brought a complicated mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt vindicated. The airline had made a serious mistake, and the truth was now clear. She hadn't been unreasonable, nor had she been treated with the respect she deserved. On the other hand, Claire also found herself reflecting on the role she had played in the situation. While she had every right to be upset, she couldn't help but wonder if there had been moments where she, too, could have handled things differently. Her usual calm and measured approach to conflict had been overshadowed by frustration and anger, and in hindsight, she realized she had contributed to the escalation. As Claire's legal team continued to gather evidence, the airline's public relations team began to prepare for the next steps. They had already been forced to admit that the situation had been mishandled, but now they needed to find a way to rebuild public trust. Claire's case had already gained significant attention, and they knew that a simple apology wouldn't be enough to quell the growing wave of criticism. The stakes were higher than ever, and both sides knew that this story wasn't going away anytime soon. Claire's phone buzzed again with an email from her legal team, summarizing the results of the investigation. As she read through the details, she felt a sense of determination settle over her. The truth was finally on her side, and she wasn't going to let the airline off the hook that easily. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about the systemic flaws that had allowed it to happen in the first place, and she was ready to make sure that they were held accountable. As the investigation results spread across the media, the public's opinion about the airline began to shift. The company, once known for its impeccable customer service, now found itself in the midst of a full-blown crisis. The airline's management scrambled to contain the fallout, but they were quickly realizing that the truth was out, and it wasn't looking good. Claire Simmons had been wronged, and the public was rallying behind her. The legal storm had officially begun, and the airline was on the defensive. Claire, meanwhile, was preparing for the next phase of her fight. She had always been a fighter, but now, with the full weight of the situation on her shoulders, she knew that she couldn't let this slip through the cracks. The airline had admitted its mistake, but the damage had already been done. This was no longer just about a seat on a plane. It was about accountability, transparency, and ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had. Her legal team was already drafting a formal lawsuit, and Claire was determined to make the airline pay for its lack of foresight and poor handling of the situation. Despite the public sympathy, Claire wasn't under any illusions about how hard this battle would be. She had been a lawyer long enough to know that high-profile cases were often fraught with complications. The airline would fight back, and the legal system could drag the process out for months, maybe even years. But Claire had one advantage. She was relentless. The legal world was her domain, and she was prepared to use every tool at her disposal to make sure the airline paid for its negligence. The lawsuit, filed within days of the investigation's conclusions, accused the airline of wrongful removal, breach of contract, and failing to adhere to proper customer service procedures. The airline's failure to adequately resolve the seating issue, combined with its lack of communication and mishandling of Claire's concerns, had caused emotional distress and reputational damage. Claire was seeking compensation, not just for herself, but as a means of holding the airline accountable and preventing similar incidents in the future. At first, the airline's legal team seemed confident in their defense. They argued that Captain Thompson had acted in the best interest of the flight's safety and that Claire's behavior had been disruptive. But as the lawsuit unfolded and more details of the airline's internal investigation came to light, the company's stance began to weaken. Their own investigation had shown that the seating error was their fault, and that the airline's policies and procedures had failed to address the issue adequately. With mounting public pressure, it became clear that the airline could not simply dismiss the case as an isolated incident. The courtroom became a battleground, with both sides presenting their cases in an increasingly heated environment. Claire's team was laser-focused on proving that the airline's treatment of their paying customer had been not only unfair, but also damaging to Claire's professional and personal reputation. They introduced witness statements from passengers who had seen how Claire was treated, providing first-hand accounts of her efforts to resolve the issue calmly before it escalated. In contrast, the airline's defense tried to argue that the captain had been forced to make a difficult decision to ensure the safety and order of the flight. As the weeks passed, the media continued to cover every twist and turn of the case, and public opinion seemed to sway in Claire's favor. She had become a symbol of standing up for one's rights, of demanding accountability from corporations that prioritize profit over people. The story was now more than just about an airline dispute. It had turned into a larger conversation about customer service, corporate responsibility, and the power dynamics between individuals and large companies. Behind closed doors, Claire's legal team was working tirelessly to build their case. They knew they had to prove not only that Claire had been wronged, but also that her removal had set a dangerous precedent for how customers could be treated. This case was about more than money. It was about sending a message that no one should ever have to experience what Claire had. And in those quiet moments between court hearings, as Claire pored over legal briefs and prepared for each new step, she realized something. This fight wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever felt powerless, overlooked, or dismissed. This battle was for the people who hadn't been given a voice, and Claire was going to make sure that voice was heard loud and clear. As the legal battle raged on, the airline began to feel the weight of its own mistakes more than ever before. The courtroom drama and media frenzy had begun to expose the cracks in its carefully polished image. While the airline's legal team continued to mount a defense, the negative press kept pouring in. Passengers from all over the world started sharing their own stories of poor customer service, and even employees of the airline came forward with accounts of discontent within the company. It became clear that the airline's reputation was suffering from more than just one mistake. It was suffering from systemic issues. With the case dragging on, the airline's executive board held an emergency meeting to discuss their next steps. They knew they had to do something to quell the public uproar and prevent further damage to their brand. Claire's legal team had not only secured a favorable narrative, but had also made it clear that they weren't backing down. If the airline didn't make a move soon, they risked further alienating their customers and prolonging the case into a drawn-out public spectacle that could devastate the company. After days of internal discussions and strategizing, the airline made a bold move. In an unprecedented step, they issued a public apology, not just a generic statement, but a heartfelt direct apology to Claire Simmons. The airline's CEO, Thomas Grant, appeared on national television to address the situation. The apology was delivered in a way that many found unexpected, and it shifted the narrative of the case in an entirely new direction. Standing before the cameras, Grant acknowledged the errors made by the airline during the entire incident, from the initial seating mistake to the way the flight attendants had mishandled the situation. He admitted that Captain Thompson's decision to remove Claire from the plane had been premature and misinformed. He also made it clear that the airline had failed to follow through with proper customer service protocols, causing both emotional distress and reputational damage to their paying customer. "We made a mistake, and it is not one that we take lightly," Grant said, his voice somber. "We failed Claire Simmons, and we failed the passengers who were affected by this incident. On behalf of the entire airline, I want to offer our sincerest apologies. We are committed to making things right, not only for Ms. Simmons, but for all of our customers." The apology struck a chord with the public. Many saw it as a sign that the airline was finally taking responsibility for their actions. The press, which had been relentless in its criticism of the airline, began to shift its tone. While not everyone was fully convinced by the apology, it was a significant step toward mending the company's relationship with its passengers. For Claire, the apology was both a relief and a vindication. She had always known that the airline's treatment of her had been unjust, but hearing the company's top leader admit fault in front of the world felt like a triumph. The airline had finally acknowledged their mistake, but she wasn't ready to let them off the hook just yet. The legal battle was still ongoing, and she was determined to ensure that the apology was backed by real changes within the company. Her legal team quickly issued a statement acknowledging the apology, but reiterating that the fight for justice was far from over. While we appreciate the airline's apology, this is only the first step, Claire's lawyer said. We are committed to ensuring that this incident leads to lasting changes in the airline's policies and customer service practices. This case is not just about compensation, it's about accountability. As the days passed, the public's view of the airline began to evolve. Some saw the apology as a sign of the company's commitment to improving, while others remained skeptical, wondering whether this was just a tactic to save face. The airline announced that it would be reviewing and overhauling its customer service training and conflict resolution procedures, pledging to ensure that such an incident would never happen again. Despite the public apology, Claire was resolute. She had fought not only for herself, but for all the passengers who had ever felt mistreated by an airline. While the apology was a step in the right direction, she knew the battle wasn't over. The system needed to change, and she was prepared to ensure it did. As Claire sat in her office that evening, the weight of the past few weeks settling on her shoulders, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The apology was a victory, but the real work had only just begun. She was determined to see this through to the end, to make sure that the airline and the entire industry would think twice before mistreating another passenger again. The public apology from the airline had undoubtedly shifted the narrative, but Claire Simmons knew that the real battle was still ahead. The media buzz surrounding the apology quickly faded, and the airline's pledge to review its policies seemed to be little more than a public relations tactic. For Claire, the apology was not enough. She needed real, tangible change, and she was determined to ensure that the airline didn't simply move on without making things right. Her legal team was working tirelessly, gathering more evidence to support their case. They called upon experts in customer service and aviation policy, hoping to demonstrate not only how the airline had mishandled her specific case, but also how its failure to adopt proper conflict resolution strategies had harmed countless other passengers. Claire knew that her case could set a precedent, one that would force the airline and others like it to rethink their customer service strategies. But as the days wore on, it became clear that the airline wasn't backing down. Despite their apology, they continued to fight in court, trying to prove that Captain Mark Thompson had acted in accordance with airline policies and had been justified in his actions. Their legal team suggested that Claire's behavior had escalated the situation unnecessarily and that removing her from the plane had been the only course of action to maintain safety. This strategy irritated Claire further. It was as though they were completely ignoring the circumstances that led to the conflict in the first place. Amid the tense legal proceedings, Claire began receiving unexpected support. Passengers who had been on the same flight, as well as former employees of the airline, came forward with their testimonies. Some shared how Claire had tried to resolve the seating issue calmly, only to be met with dismissive and condescending responses from flight attendants. Others spoke of how they had witnessed the airline's failure to offer meaningful solutions when things went wrong, preferring instead to enforce rigid policies without considering the human element involved. The turning point came one morning, just days before the next scheduled court hearing. Claire was reviewing some of the witness statements when she received an unexpected phone call. It was from an anonymous source within the airline, someone who claimed to have worked in the customer service department for over a decade. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, but the message was clear. The source wanted to talk. "I've seen what they do to people like you," the person said, barely above a whisper. "The way they treat customers. They don't care. The captain, he wasn't the only one at fault. It goes deeper than that." The source claimed that Captain Thompson's decision to remove Claire had been heavily influenced by pressure from higher-ups within the airline, who were more concerned about protecting the company's reputation than addressing the issue fairly. The source detailed how employees were often instructed to prioritize corporate interests over customer concerns, and how the airline's management consistently discouraged employees from challenging authority, even when it meant treating customers poorly. The call sent a chill down Claire's spine. If the allegations were true, it meant that the airline had created an environment where staff were afraid to act in the best interest of passengers. Worse, it suggested that Claire's mistreatment was not an isolated incident but part of a much larger pattern. After consulting with her legal team, Claire decided to pursue a new angle. She would not only fight for compensation, but also advocate for systemic change within the airline. The company's failure to foster a culture of accountability and its blatant disregard for customer welfare had to be exposed. Claire knew that if she could prove that this behavior was part of a wider institutional problem, she could force the airline to make real, lasting changes, not just for her, but for every future passenger. With the new information in hand, Claire's legal team prepared to amend their lawsuit, adding charges of corporate negligence and misconduct. This new strategy added pressure to the airline's already difficult position. They were no longer facing just one disgruntled customer. They were facing the very real possibility of a broader investigation into their internal practices. The news of the amendment to the lawsuit sent shockwaves through the media. The focus of the case had shifted from a simple dispute over a flight to a full-blown expose of the airline's internal operations. The airline, once known for its customer service, now found itself facing a crisis that extended far beyond the confines of a courtroom. Claire's fight was no longer just about her. It was about making sure that the airline's disregard for passengers was exposed to the public eye. As the court date approached, Claire felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was bigger than her personal dispute. It was about holding a powerful corporation accountable for the harm it caused to countless people. And Claire was prepared to see this through to the very end. The fight was far from over, but with each step forward, Claire felt more certain that she was on the right path. Her determination had become a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been wronged by a faceless corporation. The final chapter of Claire Simmons' battle with the airline came to a dramatic conclusion as the court proceedings reached their peak. The public, who had been following the case with growing interest, now stood at the edge of their seats. The revelations that Claire's legal team had uncovered were nothing short of explosive, and the airline's leadership, once so confident in their defense, now found themselves under the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny. The courtroom was packed, and outside, cameras lined the sidewalks as news outlets covered every moment of the proceedings. Claire's legal team had successfully built a compelling case not just about her individual mistreatment, but about a much larger issue within the airline's culture. They had presented testimony from former employees and passengers, all of whom confirmed that the airline had fostered a toxic atmosphere in which customer complaints were minimized or ignored. The airline's internal policies, rather than being customer-focused, were rigid, punitive, and designed to avoid confrontation at all costs, even when it meant sacrificing customer well-being. The turning point in the courtroom came when Claire's legal team presented the anonymous whistleblower's testimony. The source, who had worked in the airline's customer service department for over a decade, described how upper management pressured employees to prioritize corporate interests over customers' needs, often at the expense of fairness and empathy. The testimony painted a chilling picture of a company more concerned with protecting its reputation than actually addressing customer complaints or resolving issues in a meaningful way. For Claire, hearing the whistleblower's words confirmed what she had suspected all along. The airline's systemic failures were not the fault of just one person, but the result of a deeply ingrained culture of disregard for passengers. Her fight had grown from a personal grievance to a mission for justice, one that would make an impact far beyond her own case. The airline, now backed into a corner, sought to settle the case before it went to trial. They'd offered Claire a substantial sum of money as compensation, along with an official apology. However, Claire's lawyer, confident in their case, refused the offer. The settlement would not resolve the fundamental issues, and Claire knew that accepting it would mean letting the airline off the hook without ensuring real, lasting change. Instead, Claire pushed for a public hearing and a more substantial resolution. She demanded that the airline implement comprehensive reforms to its customer service policies, focusing on conflict resolution, staff training, and improved communication with passengers. She also called for an independent investigation into the company's practices, ensuring that such mistreatment would not happen again. The court, after deliberating over the evidence and considering the severity of the airline's actions, ruled in Claire's favor. Not only did the court award her compensation for emotional distress, but it also mandated that the airline undergo significant operational changes. The airline was ordered to overhaul its customer service protocols, implement conflict resolution training for all employees, and create a transparent feedback system for passengers. They were also required to issue a public apology, not just to Claire, but to all customers who had been mistreated in similar ways. The ruling was a victory not only for Claire, but for anyone who had ever been on the receiving end of poor customer service. The airline, once untouchable in its industry, had been forced to confront its mistakes and face the consequences of its actions. The court's decision sent a message to all corporations. Accountability and transparency were not optional, they were essential. In the days that followed, the airline's CEO, Thomas Grant, once again addressed the public, this time with a new tone. "We have failed our customers," he said, his voice sincere, "and we are committed to making sure that this never happens again. We are going to rebuild trust, one passenger at a time, starting with the changes that the court has ordered." For Claire, the outcome was bittersweet. The legal victory was meaningful, but it was the promise of real change that truly mattered. Her fight had forced the company to confront its failures, and she knew that her work was far from over. She had not only stood up for herself, but had given voice to every passenger who had ever been wronged by a faceless corporation. As Claire left the courthouse, the weight of the journey finally began to lift. Her battle had been long, filled with challenges, but the results were undeniable. The airline was now accountable, and its policies would change. And Claire, once just a passenger on a flight, had become an advocate for a greater cause, holding powerful corporations accountable for the way they treat the people who keep them in business. With the case officially closed, Claire took a moment to reflect on what she had achieved. She had fought for justice, and in doing so, had made a lasting impact. The legal battle was over, but her mission for fairness had only just begun. And for Claire, that was enough.